Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we'll be covering another pretty hard case. I'm sorry, I don't know why I do this to all of us. But this week, we'll be covering the case of Lacey Fletcher. Lacey was left on her own parents' couch in her urine and feces to die. The term that was used to describe the way that her body was on the couch when she was found, it was actually reported that her body was sort of melted or fused into the couch cushions of the house where her parents lived. She was found in filth and just a disgusting way to lay there and die. And it's believed that Lacey lived on that couch in her own bodily fluids for more than 12 years before her death, according to the coroner. And while Lacey was doing that, her parents were just out living their absolute best lives. And this is normally where I would say, let's get it, but I always forget to say this, and I think I'm supposed to. So, if you already listen to the podcast and you like what you hear, just take a second, rate it somewhere, review it somewhere, wherever you listen, anywhere you listen, it doesn't really matter. It's free, it only takes a minute. And if you don't want to do that, just tell a friend. Tell a friend if you think they'd like the show, just tell them about it. That's all I'm asking. I think that's all I'm supposed to say. So, without further ado, let's get it. Lacey Fletcher was born to her parents, Sheila and Clay, on November 25th, 1985 in Louisiana. This is also where she would live until her death. And I wasn't able to find a lot about Lacey's childhood, her upbringing, things of that nature, which this is a super new case. It's still going to trial. There's not a whole lot to be found as of right now. But from what I was able to find, Lacey was an only child. I don't want to say that with 100% certainty. You know, maybe there are siblings that don't want to be involved in the case and don't want to be in the media, which is fine. But I couldn't find siblings. And Lacey would live and grow up in the same house with her parents up until her death in Slaughter, Louisiana. And the coincidence of the name of the town being Slaughter and the way that this poor woman was killed is a little more than coincidence for me. Lacey's parents are the biggest kinds of hypocrites. They went to church every week, and they made the world and everybody who knew them think that they were good, loving, church-going people, and they just weren't. People who knew Lacey's parents, Sheila and Clay, literally described them as, quote-unquote, pillars of the community. But they were anything but. Lacey's mom, Sheila, get this now, Lacey's mom, Sheila, worked as a police and court clerk in Baker, Louisiana. So, Lacey's mom literally worked within some parts of our courts and justice system, which is scary as shit to me. But Sheila's latest job, though? Oh, her latest job was working with the assistant of the city prosecutor. So she was all up in the court system. How does this happen and stay under the radar like it was? And following the arrest and the case against Clay Fletcher, he resigned from his job where he worked at the Baton Rouge War Roundtable. I am not even going to pretend to know what that is, so we're going to move right along from that. Lacey seemingly had a pretty normal and average childhood. Like, this isn't a case where everyone dropped the ball and the death should have never happened. This is actually the complete opposite of that. No one ever suspected any abuse. There weren't a bunch of red flags that were missed in Lacey's case. Lacey played volleyball, and in pictures from her time playing volleyball, she looks completely healthy. And there was nothing that I could find that threw up red flags for anyone that was around or knew the family. But it is commonly reported that Lacey was either on the autism spectrum or had some kind of Asperger syndrome or both. I saw both conditions listed. I saw one condition listed, like one or the other, in a lot of places. Something else that Lacey supposedly had was locked-in syndrome, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But when Lacey was younger, it wasn't really obvious to her schoolmates or friends that she had been diagnosed with either condition. It seemed like during her teenage years is when Lacey's condition seemed to worsen around, if my math is right, around the 9th grade of high school. Which would be around the same time. She would be 13, 14, 15-ish. So I don't math. Don't come for me. And it seems like when Lacey's condition did start to worsen, that's when Lacey was pulled out of, like, normal public school. That's when she started her homeschooling, and she did that for the remainder of her high school experience. Friends and neighbors reported that Lacey was extremely smart and that even though she was the same age as everyone else that was in her friend group, Lacey was extremely immature for her age. Almost like she stopped maturing, at a way younger age than everybody else. Because while most of the other girls Lacey's age are worried about makeup and boys and who doesn't like them and what outfit makes them look the best, I don't even know how to say that for a child, but Lacey was more into Disney movies and princesses than anything else. She would still invite friends from high school over to watch Disney movies with her, even though by this time they were all around the age of 16 to 18 years old, and most of the time Lacey's friends would just politely decline her offer. And I saw one guy that she had been friends with that said that, Lacey would invite me over to watch Disney movies, but I was 18 and already riding a motorcycle. So, I think that kind of gives you an idea of her maturity level. There was another friend that was interviewed after Lacey's death, and it was another friend from school who said that she just remembered Lacey as sweet. And this friend just used the word sweet over and over and over again, and she eventually said that sweet was the only word that she kept coming back to describe Lacey. That friend wanted to remain unnamed. As Lacey's conditions worsened, she started to suffer from severe social anxiety, and she was treated for a few years by professionals for the social anxiety, which I'm definitely not an expert in anything in any sense of the word, but I would think that social anxiety is pretty normal for the average person, so I would assume someone, on the autism spectrum or somebody suffering from Asperger's would have an extra hard time coping and dealing with their anxieties. They would need professional help. So she did this for a few years. And once Lacey started the homeschooling program, somewhere around the year 2000, she wasn't seen very often by friends, family members, or even neighbors anymore. And before her condition worsened, neighbors had reported seeing Lacey outside doing normal kid things. And she would even go outside and work out with weights and exercise and hang out in the yard. But all that stopped once Lacey wasn't in public school anymore. Lacey also pulled back from her normal friend group, and she was staying home more and more and more often. Which I feel like that happens as you get older. You just want to be home. But this situation's a little bit different just because Lacey's conditions. Lacey's parents would go out to dinners, church functions, holiday events, and they would do all of this without Lacey. And anytime somebody would ask, hey, where's Lacey? How's she doing? Sheila and Clay would just tell people that she was at home, that she didn't want to come out, she wasn't feeling up to it. And she had gotten a lot more reclusive as her autism had gotten worse. Lacey had started isolating herself from anyone in the outside world. Lacey wasn't going to church anymore. She wasn't riding to the grocery store with her mom or going to the bank with her mom. It seems like no one ever saw much of Lacey after she was pulled from her base school and put into the homeschool program. Actually, the last reported sighting from a neighbor of the Fletcher family was a man by the name of Robert. And Robert he's that neighbor that does all the interviews when some shit pops off in the neighborhood. Almost every quote from a neighbor is from this guy, Robert. But Robert says that the last time he reportedly saw Lacey out and about, she was approximately 21 years old. And he had seen Lacey outside working out with some small weights. He thought this was odd, especially since Lacey had always been pretty thin, but she had also always been athletic, so he didn't really think much of it. And in 2017, this same neighbor, Robert, had noticed that he hadn't seen Lacey in a while. So the last sighting that he could remember was when she was 21. And if she was 21 or approximately 21 the last time that he saw her, if my math is right, again, I don't math, but that would put the time somewhere around 2006. So this was 2017 when the same neighbor noticed that he hadn't seen Lacey in a while, and he finally asked Clay, hey, has Lacey gotten married? Did she go to college? Maybe she had moved out of her parents' house. And Clay told him that Lacey was fine, that she still lived with him and, Sheila in their house. But the neighbor, Robert, said that Lacey's dad, Clay, quickly changed the subject after that and just kind of wouldn't say anything else about it. But he still didn't explain why he hadn't seen Lacey in so long, especially if she still lived with them in their house right next door. See, this is another thing. People would often ask Sheila and Clay where Lacey was, and they would always respond with the same burnout line, like, oh, Lacey didn't feel like coming out, or that Lacey was home and just didn't feel like going out with them. And of course, because these are her literal parents, nobody ever really questioned this. They just kind of accepted it and went on with their plans or with their day. And when Lacey was somewhere around the age of 25 in 2010, Lacey's parents went to an appointment for Lacey, but they didn't actually take Lacey with them, which is weird. Lacey's parents were basically just going in and asking what they should do about Lacey not wanting to leave the house and not wanting to get off the couch, because she hadn't always been that way. At least not until her autism had supposedly gotten worse. So we don't exactly know what happened up until this point. But finally, in 2022, on January 3rd, Lacey's mom called 911 and reported that something was wrong with her 36-year-old daughter, who supposedly suffered from something called locked-in syndrome, which is a rare medical disorder of the nervous system that basically makes someone almost completely paralyzed, except for the muscles that control things like eye movement and consciousness, which just means that Lacey may not have been able to move or speak, but she felt and knew every single thing that was going on with her body as far as pain, from the bed sores, maggots eating her literal flesh, ulcers, everything that happened to her up until her death, she felt, which just makes this case so much sadder. And even if Lacey did suffer from locked-in syndrome, why wouldn't her own parents bathe her, roll her over so she doesn't get bed sores, feed her, or any of the hundreds of things that you would do for somebody you love who can't do things for themselves? Right now, my father-in-law is living with us. He just had 2 strokes. I have literally bathed him, changed his diaper, changed his clothes. I'm doing those things for him because he can't. Because I love him. Because that's what you freaking do. That's what you do. But nonetheless, even after the police arrived, neither of Lacey's parents were placed under arrest. And all I can think is instead of tell me why, it's tell me how? How the hell were they not arrested? I honestly think the police didn't know what to do in a situation like this. This was very likely something that they had never seen before. The community rallied around Sheila and Clay and treated them like any other grieving parents should be treated. But these weren't your normal grieving parents who had just unexpectedly lost their child, due to a medical condition or a fatal accident. They inevitably let Lacey lay on that couch and die. Even Lacey's obituary is super short, super dry, not at all what you would expect from parents who had just lost a child that supposedly makes their world spin on its axis. It doesn't mention Lacey's outgoing personality. It doesn't mention her love of Disney characters. It doesn't mention anything remotely heartwarming. I'm actually going to read it just so you understand this is not an obituary for your child. The obituary read, quote, Lacey Fletcher, daughter of Clay and Sheila Fletcher of Slaughter, Louisiana, who was called to be with her Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, on January 3rd, 2022. Relatives and friends are invited to join the family for visitation at Baker Funeral Home, 6401 Groom Road on Tuesday, January 11th, 2022. From 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. with a brief graveside service immediately following the Crest Hill Memorial Gardens in Baker, Louisiana. To send flowers to the family or plant a tree in memory of Lacey Elaine Fletcher, please visit our tribute store. End quote. That is it. That is literally the entire obituary. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about an obituary. Normally, I don't even look at an obituary unless it pertains to the case. But considering the way that Lacey's body was found, they obviously didn't care, and it shows. The media was absolutely not having this from her parents. People wanted to know why they had let Lacey lay on the couch like that, and why her body was in the condition that it was found in. Once stuff started coming out in the media, of course, the community was like, fuck these parents. They were not supportive anymore. But people also started to wonder why Lacey's parents hadn't made a public statement. Sheila and Clay Fletcher did release a statement, but they did it through their attorney. The statement said, quote, they don't want to relive the pain of losing a child through the media. They have been through a lot of heartache over the years. Anyone who has lost a child knows what it's like. And while ethically it's very clear that these parents did something monstrous, things are more complicated when it comes to the law. That's why the sheriff, who was initially in charge of the case, decided to turn everything over to the DA's office and to let a grand jury decide what charges, if any, would be brought forward against Lacey's parents. So let's talk about why people were so outraged about the condition that Lacey's body was found in. Lacey was found inside of her parents' house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She was 36 years old, and she was found partially nude, sitting upright on a couch that was so eroded with urine and feces that the couch cushions were actually rotted from the bodily fluids. Lacey had bed sores that were so bad from where she hadn't been moved in so long or rolled over or turned. These weren't just regular bed sores. These bed sores were infected down to the bone. She had been laying there on that couch long enough for bed sores to get so badly infected that the infection had spread into her bones. Lacey's hair was completely mangled and matted together, with not only bed sores covering her body, but also ulcers. Lacey had live bugs and insects and rodent shit in her wounds. Maggots covering the majority of her body. She was literally submerged in piss and shit on a couch cushion that was completely rotted away. Lacey was 36 years old at the time of her death, and I saw two different weights. They were both under 100 pounds. I saw that Lacey only weighed 96 pounds, and I saw that Lacey only weighed 69 pounds. Either way, that is extremely small for somebody that is 36 years old. That's just tiny. And Lacey had also somehow gotten COVID. But if she hadn't left that house for decades, then that would mean that her own parents had to have given her COVID. I would guess that this COVID probably came from all the dinners and church functions that they went to without her, but I'm just guessing. It's believed that Lacey laid on that couch surrounded by her own excrements for approximately 12 years or longer. Medical professionals say that Lacey's death was attributed to acute medical neglect dating back to 2010 or longer. And since Lacey had been found in her parents' house, neighbors had some things to say. Well, it was mostly just the one neighbor named Robert, but whatever. Robert claims that Lacey had always been a quote-unquote pretty normal kid up until she became more isolated and started staying inside more and more often. The coroner in this case is Dr. Bickham. He worked Lacey's case. He said, quote, "The scene was sickening. I've seen some horrible things in my life, but nothing like this." Dr. Bickham also said, "I couldn't eat for a week and I cried for a week," which that has to say something. This man literally deals with dead bodies for a living. And this was the case that had him crying for a week and not being able to eat. That says something. District Attorney Sam DeQuilla said about this case, quote, "The coroner and the sheriff's office initially investigated the case. The condition that she was said to be found in was just unbelievable. You don't treat anybody or animals like that. This wasn't a case where Lacey's parents suffocated her or a case where Lacey's parents shot her. They intentionally let her lay there on a couch for years and years and years in her own urine and feces until her body just couldn't hold on any longer and she had no option but to finally give up. I don't know if COVID was the main cause of death or maybe if her body was so frail and fragile already that contracting COVID was just the last straw, but I feel like they should charge them with murder just for giving her COVID. If she wasn't leaving the house on her own, then obviously that was their fault. And like I said, Lacey passed away in 2022. It's 2023 and we're still dealing with COVID. So it's not like, 2019 and COVID was over. No, it's still not over. And here we are, it's 2023. The sheriff who was working the case basically said that he had been a sheriff for about 6 years and he had still never seen anything like this in all of his time on the force. This was a scene that just could not be matched with any other scene. The Daily Mail claimed that pictures of the crime scene were so horrific that they couldn't even be posted to the public just for the fact that they were so graphic. The crime scene was described to say that Lacey's body was buried up to her shoulders in her own excrements inside of a deep-ass hole in the couch. I will be posting this couch online because that is the only way for your brain to fathom what she laid in for 12 years or longer. Lacey's body was teeny tiny and emaciated, and Lacey's body had actually eaten away at the couch cushions. Her body was almost fused or melted into the cushions where she had been laying there for so long. It also says that Lacey's body was found with her body slumped over to the left side, nearly completely naked except for a small t-shirt that wasn't even covering her breast. And the shirt was pulled up that way when her body was found. So if Lacey has this locked-in syndrome where she's completely paralyzed and only her eye movements and consciousness are, really the only muscles working, who pulled her shirt up? Why was her shirt up? Why was she not clothed? I have so many questions. Lacey's mouth and eyes were also found open at her time of death. Feces and urine were smeared almost all over her body. It was in her hair, her eyes, her ears, literally everywhere on her body was covered in her own urine and feces. And I can feel myself getting pissed off about this again as I'm reading my own notes, especially considering the coroner reported that Lacey had passed away anywhere from 24 to 48 hours before her mom Sheila called 911. And on top of all of this, Lacey had reportedly not been to the doctor since she was around 16 years old. How do you not take your kid with medical needs to the doctor for decades? Again, I don't math, but that would be more than 20 years since the last time she had seen a doctor. And Lacey's parents would say things like, oh, she was just never sick, so we never took her to the doctor. Okay, cool. But she still had medical needs that needed to be checked on periodically. This shit don't make no sense to me. And according to Lacey's mom, Sheila, Lacey was alive at 10 p.m. Sheila laid down, had fallen asleep, and had gotten back up around 2 p.m., which is when she found that Lacey was dead. Sheila also says that Lacey had refused to get off the couch in years and years, and that she would only use the bathroom on the couch or on a towel, like she was scared to get off the couch. The couch that Lacey was found on was reportedly a 60s-style couch inside of the Fletcher's living room. There was some sort of toilet sitting nearby the couch that Lacey's body was fused to, along with a stack of clothes on the table that was covered in things like nasal spray, lotions, powder that you would use for like a diaper rash, baby wipes or like body cleansing wipes, and a few other things that her parents obviously never used. Okay, so it's not like they couldn't afford these things because they had them and they had them on a table sitting right by the damn couch. Why is it so hard to use them? I get it, it's exhausting. I get that. But there are so many other options where this did not have to happen. There were also a couple of boxes of DVDs sitting nearby the couch, which were most likely like younger kid movies from like pictures I could find. And during the forensic examination, it was found that Lacey did in fact pass away in the early morning hours of January 3rd, 2022. That's when she was pronounced dead, but like I said, the coroner believed it was more like 24 to 48 hours before the 911 call was placed that Lacey had actually died. There were also like yellow colored spots covering Lacey's body, which I would assume are infection spots. The forensic examination also found that the fleshy part of Lacey's butt was black in color, which again I would assume to be infection. The urine and feces that she had been laying in had kind of eaten away at the skin where her literal flesh was showing. And from where Lacey hadn't been moved on the couch in so long, it was literally just her flesh infused into the couch. And I read in a few places that they found pieces of the couch cushion in Lacey's stomach, like maybe she had gotten so hungry she was eating that, but I couldn't find that on a website good enough to confirm it. There was also a puddle found behind the couch in between the wall and the couch. The wall was sitting against the couch in between that little space. And that was believed to be urine. Lacey's cause of death is a mile-long list of causes. Some of those are, obviously medical neglect, severe medical neglect at that, which was caused from extreme malnutrition, acute ulcer formation, acute starvation, immobility, and a slew of other things that eventually led to Lacey getting sepsis. And for anybody who's unfamiliar with what sepsis is, I couldn't figure out how to explain it to make it make sense for anybody else. So, Google, here we come. Google says that sepsis occurs when chemicals are released into the bloodstream to fight infection, which can in turn trigger inflammation. Bottom line, it's extremely dangerous, and it can cause your organs to shut down and fail, and it can eventually lead to death if untreated. Which, that is exactly why we're here. And, okay, let's go back a little bit to the locked-in syndrome. I said that Lacey had been diagnosed earlier with locked-in syndrome. The coroner said that he had no idea where that term came from, that all his years working in the medical field, he had never heard that term before, and that he didn't know when she had been diagnosed with it. He says that the only conditions that he can say definitively that Lacey had were social anxiety and autism. That's it. So even the touch of Asperger's wasn't a diagnosis that he could get behind. And I don't know how I feel about this locked-in syndrome, because Lacey was able to walk and use her muscles before she was solely isolated to that couch. She had played volleyball, she had worked out with small weights, she had done all of these things before she started never leaving the house. So maybe something did happen that made it where Lacey couldn't use her limbs or muscles, but there was never an actual diagnosis that I could find. Either way, it was 4 months after Lacey's death that anybody was actually charged with murder. District Attorney Sam DeQuilla said, quote, "If we have an outright murder, we arrest people immediately. If we have a case like this where the parents aren't going anywhere, sometimes they're not arrested. We're all of the consensus that we're going to let a grand jury handle it." So, District Attorney Sam DeQuilla also told a local media outlet that he had every intention of getting a grand jury to convene and ask for second-degree murder charges to be brought against Sheila and Clay Fletcher. And after Lacey's death, it was 4 months before charges were finally brought against her parents. It was on May the 3rd, 2022, that Clay and Sheila Fletcher were both arrested and charged with second-degree murder after a grand jury finally decided that Lacey's parents deserved more than manslaughter charges, and they went with second-degree murder charges instead. And I'm guessing the crime scene pictures is probably what helped the grand jury get to this second-degree murder charge. But that's just a guess. And second-degree murder charge is life in prison, which is hopefully what Clay and Sheila get. That's what they deserve. But this case hasn't gone to trial yet. We'll talk about that in a few. There were actually medical professionals that had to be brought in for the people within the grand jury just because the pictures that were shown were legitimately bad enough to send somebody into shock or an anxiety-ridden state. Everybody in the room was in complete and utter shock when they heard the case and were shown the pictures of the way that Lacey's body was found and the condition that she was left in. The condition that her body was found in took years and years and years to get her body in that condition. This didn't happen overnight or even over the course of a few weeks or months. This was years and years of severe medical neglect. Both Sheila and Clay Fletcher were out on bail within 36 hours of their arrest on the second-degree murder charges. Sheila had been able to make bail first on May the 4th, just the day after they were arrested, and Clay ended up being released the next day on May the 5th on bond, just 12 hours after Sheila was out. Both Sheila and Clay's bond were set at $300,000, which obviously wasn't enough because they were able to somehow manage to get out. I don't know if it was assets or if they were just loaded, but either way, they're out walking the streets. The fact that her parents are even able to bond out of jail is completely ridiculous to me. But they did, and here we are. And as the couple walked out of the jail, they kept their heads down and they didn't comment to any of the media that was there. And before I go any further, I just want to say, Lacey's parents could have taken her to a nursing home or a long-term care program, or probably even dropped her off at a fire station like the safe haven law. I would think that would apply to adults who can't take care of themselves. They could have done anything besides literally what they did. Lacey's parents are sticking with their story that Lacey wanted to be homeschooled, and that Lacey wanted to stay home, and that Lacey wanted to lay on the couch for more than 12 years in her own piss and shit, basically saying that Lacey chose to use the restroom on herself and then lay in it. And even if that's the case, she obviously wasn't in, sound mind enough to know that that wasn't okay. But according to Sheila, Lacey was of very sound mind up until her death. So make that make sense. Sheila also claims that they brought Lacey all of her meals and that she was taken care of. Sheila is also sticking to her guns and is adamant that she cleaned Lacey's wounds and tried to keep her clean, and that Lacey never complained of pain from any of these literal hundreds of bed sores, ulcers, and insects inside of her. I'm sorry, but I'm starting to think these parents had honestly just gotten so used to the smell and the way that Lacey looked that they didn't see anything wrong with it. Which just leads me to another question. Did Lacey's parents actually live in that house with Lacey and just never have people over? I can't imagine having somebody in my living room for 12 years or longer in that condition and somebody not coming over to visit and being like, well, I guess I need to call the police. It just doesn't make sense. Because, they had to have been, if they did live there, they had to have been used to the smell, the insects, the maggots, because neighbors never came out and said like, oh, I didn't know anyone lived in that house. But what some of their neighbors did say is that they didn't even know that Sheila and Clay had a daughter until she was found dead. I have other questions, like, did Sheila and Clay ever go on vacation or like trips out of town? Because if they did go on trips or vacation, nobody was paid to stay there and look after Lacey. That would have meant she would have been left home alone with no food, no water, no bath, no clean clothes. And obviously they didn't have somebody come in and sit with Lacey, because if they would have done that, surely to God somebody would have called for a wellness check on Lacey after they saw her in that condition. I just can't figure out how this was able to go on for so long. The trial for Sheila and Clay Fletcher was supposed to start on February 6th of this year in 2023. But it was rescheduled for June 19th of 2023, where they both plan to plead not guilty. So I guess we'll all have to wait and see what comes out of the trial when it actually does happen. According to brproud.com, Sheila and Clay Fletcher did make an appearance in court on February 22nd of this year, 2023, to go over legal concerns. I'm not sure how they plan to plead not guilty with literally like a handbook on a guilty verdict. But I guess we'll see how this trial goes. I will be following it super, super closely. If anything comes up as far as like small updates where I won't be able to do a whole episode on it, then I will record just the 4, 5, 6 minutes of the updates and post those so that everybody can keep up with what's going on. Because I'm sure this case is going to piss you off just as bad as it pissed me off. And for now, that's all I have. I'm realizing this is going to be a pretty short episode. I didn't realize it would be this short, but there's really not a whole lot here, and this is a case that's still in the media and still happening, so I did want to try to cover it. Like I said in the beginning, rate, review, share, follow. I don't know. I'm not good at this. But I guess let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. I'll see you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.